In the late 1950s, Hollywood was a place where legends walked like ordinary men smoking on sound stages, laughing between takes, hiding their fears behind dark sunglasses. Power was loud back then. Directors ruled like kings. Stars learned to survive with thick skin. And young actors, they learned fast till they were forgotten. On the sun-baked set of Rio Bravo, one of the most anticipated westerns of its time, the air shimmered with heat and expectation. The cameras weren't rolling yet, but tension already was. And that tension would soon explode into a moment no one would forget. Not because of violence, not because of scandal, but because of what happened after. The young actor nobody noticed his name in the script was small, 2 lines. A handful of background moments, barely enough screen time to matter. But to him, it was everything. Let's call him Eddie Nolan. Eddie was 23, fresh from New York with a suitcase, a head full of dreams, and a heart that believed in miracles. He had worked odd jobs, slept on couches, and once washed dishes for a man who swore he'd be a star one day too. Eddie didn't mind being poor. What he minded was being invisible. And on the Rio Bravo set, invisibility was the norm for someone like him. John Wayne towered over everyone physically and spiritually. Ricky Nelson brought youth and music. And then there was Dean Martin Cool.com, effortless. The kind of man who didn't have to prove anything. Eddie watched them from a distance like a kid watching heroes through a store window. He didn't want fame, he wanted belonging. The director who didn't tolerate weakness, Howard Hawks, was legendary. Brilliant, demanding, unforgiving. He believed great films were born from pressure and that fear was a tool. He expected actors to be ready, perfect, unbreakable. On that morning, Hawks noticed Eddie missing his mark. Once, then twice. By the 3rd time, Hawks slammed his script shut. Cut. The entire set froze. Eddie felt the blood rush from his face. He knew what was coming. Hawks walked straight toward him, boots crunching against gravel, eyes sharp like broken glass. "You're late on your cue," Hawks snapped. I'm sorry, Mr. Hawks." Just before Eddie could finish the sentence, slap. Not a punch, not a shove. A slap, loud, sudden, humiliating. The sound echoed off the canyon walls. The crew went silent. Eddie staggered back, stunned, not just by the sting on his cheek, but by the shame. His ears rang. His vision blurred. No one moved. No one spoke. No one spoke. No one helped, except one man. Dean Martin didn't stand up fast. He stood upright. Dean Martin had been leaning against a wagon, sipping coffee like the world couldn't touch him. But the moment that slap landed, he straightened, slowly, deliberately, not angry, not dramatic, just present. He walked toward Hawks, not fast, not slow, until he stood between the director and the young actor. And then Dean said something so calm, so controlled, so human, that it cut deeper than any shout ever could. Howard Dean said quietly, "You don't hit people on my set." The words were simple, but the meaning was heavy. The crew stared. Hawks scoffed. "You're set." "I'm the director." Dean didn't raise his voice. "Then direct," he replied. "Don't bully." Silence swallowed the canyon. The moment that changed Eddie's life, Eddie expected Hawks to explode. Instead, something else happened. He hesitated, just for a second. And that second changed everything. Dean turned to Eddie. "Kid," he said gently, "you okay?" Eddie nodded, though his throat was tight. Dean put a hand on his shoulder. "Good. Then stand here with me." And Eddie did. Not behind, not beside. With what nobody saw coming that day, Hawks didn't apologize. But he didn't touch Eddie again either. And from that moment on, something shifted. Dean Martin started talking to Eddie between takes, asking about his life, his goals, his fears. He learned Eddie's father had died in a factory accident, that Eddie had sent half his paycheck home, that Eddie was terrified he'd fail. Dean listened, really listened. And then one afternoon, he said something Eddie would never forget. You don't need to be loud to be strong. You just need to be steady. The seed of a new Hollywood people on that set didn't realize it yet, but they had just witnessed the beginning of a quiet revolution. Not a protest, not a scandal. A shift in how power treated potential. Dean Martin didn't just protect Eddie. He redefined respect. And Eddie? He stopped shaking. He started believing. The slap still lived in Eddie Nolan's bones. Days had passed since it happened, but every time the wind cut across the Rio Bravo set, he felt it again, sharp, sudden, humiliating. Not on his skin anymore, but in his pride. Dean Martin had defended him. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had felt it. But something worse followed. Whispers. Not cruel ones, not loud ones. Just the kind that carry danger. Kid got lucky. Martin stepped in. Don't mess up again. Luck is fragile in Hollywood. And Eddie knew it. The call that almost ended everything. 3 nights later, Eddie sat alone in his tiny rented room. The ceiling fan rattled like it might fall. His script pages were folded, unfolded, folded again. He hadn't memorized them. He already knew them by heart. Then the phone rang. Not a friendly ring, a sharp, urgent one. Eddie picked it up. This is the production office. His stomach dropped. Yes, sir. There was a pause. Long enough to hurt. We're reconsidering your position on the film. T stopped breathing. You're talented, the voice continued, but this set runs on discipline. We don't need distractions. Distractions? That's what he had become. Sir, I'll work harder, Eddie said. I won't miss another mark, I promise. Another pause. Then report to Stage B at 10 p.m. tonight. The line went dead. Stage B was never used at night. The sun had disappeared hours ago when Eddie arrived. Stage B was dark, empty. No cameras, no crew, just shadows. Eddie stood in the doorway, heart pounding. Something about the silence felt wrong. Not peaceful, not calm, expectant. Then a voice came from the dark. You came. Eddie jumped. A match struck. Light flared, and in that light, he saw Dean Martin, sitting on a crate. Jacket off, tie loose, face serious, not smiling. You were about to quit. Dean closed the match. Dark again. Then the overhead lights snapped on. Dean stood. You were about to walk away, weren't you? Eddie tried to speak. Couldn't. Dean stepped closer. You think they were calling you in to warn you? Eddie swallowed. Dean's voice was calm, but heavy. No, kid. They were going to quietly erase you. That word hit harder than the slap. Erase. The truth about Hollywood power. Dean leaned against a light stand. You know how this town works. Eddie shook his head. Dean continued. You don't get fired loudly. You disappear quietly. One call, one excuse, one less name on the call sheet. Eddie's hands were shaking now. So why am I here? He asked. Dean didn't answer right away. Then, because I didn't like the way they treated you, a deal no one else would make. Dean took out a cigarette, lit it, and spoke through the smoke. They think you're weak. I don't. Eddie looked up. Dean's eyes locked on his. They think I protected you because I felt sorry for you. He shook his head. I protected you because I saw myself in you. That changed everything. Dean's past. Nobody knew. Dean finally sat down again. When I came out here, I was told I didn't belong. Didn't look right, didn't sound right. Didn't fit. He exhaled. I learned something the hard way. This town doesn't reward talent. It tests courage. Eddie listened like his life depended on it. Because it did. The choice. Dean stood up. They gave me an ultimatum. Eddie's eyes widened. They said, either you go, or I stop interfering. The room went quiet. "You're Dean Martin," Eddie whispered. "They wouldn't," Dean cut him off. "They absolutely would." The risk Dean took one step forward. "So here's what's going to happen." Eddie's chest felt tight. "You're staying?" "Not because they allow it, because I insist." Eddie stared. "And if they push back?" he asked. Dean's jaw tightened. "Then I push harder." The night that changed the set forever. The next morning, something strange happened. Eddie's name was higher on the call sheet. Not last, not forgotten. Watched, respected. And when Howard Hawks walked by him, he didn't say a word. Didn't look at him, but he didn't touch him either. The shift no one could stop, Dean had drawn a line, and the entire set felt it. People started standing straighter, speaking softer, working better, not because they were afraid, because they felt protected. Eddie's first real scene later that day, Eddie nailed his scene. Not perfectly, but honestly. And Dean watched from the sidelines, arms folded, nodding. Not like a star, like a mentor. By the time Eddie Nolan's name moved up the call sheet, something inside him had already changed. He didn't walk onto the Rio Bravo set like an extra anymore. He walked like someone who had been seen. But being seen is dangerous. Because once the spotlight touches you, it also reveals your fear. The day everything almost collapsed, it happened on a Tuesday. The heat was brutal. The kind that makes tempers short and mistakes loud. Eddie had one major moment that day, a speaking line in front of John Wayne and the camera. One line, but it felt like a cliff. He stood behind the false saloon wall, waiting for his cue. His heart hammered so hard he could hear it over the wind machine. Dean Martin stood nearby, arms crossed, watching. Not interfering, not rescuing. Testing the line he couldn't say. The cue came. Eddie stepped out. The camera rolled. John Wayne turned. And Eddie's mind went blank. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Silence filled the set. Howard Hawks stared. Eddie felt his legs weaken. "Cut," Hawks said coldly. Eddie swallowed. "I'm sorry, sir." Hawks didn't answer. Dean didn't move. The crew shifted uncomfortably, and Eddie knew deep down this was the moment. Not when he was slapped, not when he was defended. But now, Dean let him fall. Howard Hawks turned to Dean. "Well," he said, "your protege can't even speak." Dean didn't defend him, didn't interrupt, didn't soften the blow. He just looked at Eddie. Long, steady. Then he said something that cut deeper than Hawks ever could. Again, the second try was worse. The camera rolled again. Eddie stepped out. Tried to speak. His voice cracked. Wrong words. Wrong timing. Cut. Hawks snapped. This time, some of the crew looked away. They knew what was coming, but Dean still didn't move. He didn't rescue Eddie. He let the moment burn. The walk-away Hawks shook his head. "We're done with him," he said. Eddie felt the floor disappear under his feet. He turned and walked away from the set. Not fast, not angry, just broken. The door that locked his future Eddie didn't go back to his room. He went to Stage B, the same place where Dean had spoken to him before. He sat on a crate, head in his hands. Then the door closed behind him, locked. He looked up. Dean stood there. "You think I saved you before?" Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile. "You think I saved you before?" Eddie didn't answer. Dean stepped closer. "I didn't." Eddie looked up. Dean's eyes were sharp now. "I gave you a chance. That's all." "The truth nobody told him." "You want to know why I didn't stop Hawks just now?" Dean asked. Eddie nodded. "Because if I did, you'd never be strong enough to stand on your own." That hurt, but it was real. The test. Dean took a folded page from his jacket, handed it to Eddie. It wasn't Eddie's line. It was longer, harder, more emotional. Dean spoke quietly. Memorize it, deliver it, and mean it. Eddie stared at the page. Tonight? Dean nodded. The night that forged him, Eddie didn't sleep. He paced, whispered, repeated the words until his throat hurt. Not like an actor, like a man fighting for air. The return the next morning, Eddie walked back onto the set, not as a boy, as a storm held together by discipline. Dean saw him, and for the first time, smiled. The scene that stopped time, the camera rolled. Eddie stepped forward, spoke the lines, not loud, not flashy. True, the set went silent. Even Hawks didn't interrupt. When Eddie finished, no one spoke for 3 full seconds. Then, print it, Hawks said quietly. The shift became real. That word print meant everything. It meant Eddie hadn't just survived. A P'd arrived. By the time Eddie Nolan delivered that scene, the wind on the Rio Bravo set felt different. Not hotter. Not colder. Heavier, like something important was about to break. Or be born. Howard Hawks didn't congratulate him. He didn't smile. But he also didn't look away. And in Hollywood, that was respect. The meeting they didn't want Eddie to hear 2 days later. Eddie was sent to retrieve a prop from the production office. The door was half open. Inside, he heard voices. Hawks, a studio executive, and someone else he didn't recognize. Martin's getting involved too much, the executive said. This isn't a charity, Hawks answered calmly. He's protecting the kid. That's the problem, the man replied. He's teaching him not to be afraid. Silence followed. Then Hawks said something Eddie would never forget. This town survives on fear. Eddie froze. The plan to break Dean, the executive, lowered his voice. Then we remove the shield. We isolate Martin. We make him choose between loyalty and legacy. Eddie's heart started racing. He backed away from the door without making a sound and ran. The warning Eddie found Dean near the trailers, studying his script. Dean, Eddie whispered urgently. They're planning something. Dean looked up. Eddie told him everything. Every word. Dean listened without interrupting. When Eddie finished, Dean closed the script, very slowly. Good, he said. This is the part they don't understand, Dean stood. They think loyalty is weakness. He smiled slightly. They're about to learn its power. The confrontation that afternoon, Dean was summoned to the production office, alone. The door closed behind him. Inside were Hawks and 2 studio executives. One spoke first. Dean, we're concerned. Dean didn't sit. Then, don't be, he said calmly. The ultimatum, they didn't smile. You've crossed a line, the executive said. You're undermining authority. Dean nodded. Good, that caught them off guard. You have influence, the man continued. You should use it carefully. Dean leaned forward. No, you should treat people carefully. The threat, the executive's voice hardened. You can finish this film, or you can walk away. Dean didn't blink. You don't fire me, he said. You reveal yourselves. Silence slammed into the room. The risk that could have ended him, Hawks spoke quietly. You'd sacrifice your career for a kid? Dean answered without hesitation. I'd sacrifice my comfort for what's right. The door that changed Hollywood, Dean turned, put his hand on the door, then stopped. He looked back. You built this system on fear, he said. I'm tearing it down with respect, and he walked out. The set holds its breath. Word spread fast. Dean Martin might leave the film. The crew panicked. The studio hesitated, and Eddie waited. The call that shocked everyone that night. The phone rang in Eddie's room. It was Dean. They backed down, he said simply. Eddie sat down. They need the film. They need the name. And they just learned they don't own my spine. The final scene the next day, Hawks walked up to Eddie. Not angry, not cold, just honest. You earned your place, he said. Then he walked away. The legacy Eddie Nolan didn't become famous overnight, but he became respected. And Dean Martin? He became something more than a star. He became a line people didn't cross.